Okay, well, hey, welcome everybody to the Chechi Big Byte for today, November 15, 2023. And I'm very excited today to share with you our presenter, Dr. Matt Roberts. He is going to be talking to us today about generative AI in education, teaching, and learning, and some of the ethical and integrity considerations that he has experienced and some of the things that he's been thinking about. I know that he has been doing some work around this, so I'm excited to hear what he has to say. I'm Rick Vandermolen. I'm your co-chair. Naoki Kenabashi is also on the call, and we are the co-chairs for the Chechi Technology Committee. I just want to make a plug for that, remember, you're welcome to attend any of our meetings that we have each month, although today we will not be having a meeting after Dr. Roberts' presentation. Will be concluding at 4 p.m. So for those of you who regularly attend, there's my gift to you. Also here in the room with us, Dr. Roberts, myself, and our graduate assistant, Pooja Gadagay, is here with us, and she has also been very helpful. I'm sure that you can see her through one of the cameras there. Go ahead and wave there, Pooja. There we go. We got Pooja waving.
Hi.
She's been very helpful and instrumental in helping us with some of the organization and putting together our promo videos and all sorts of other things. So I want to give a shout out to her in the work that she does for helping us to put this on. So thank you, Pooja, for all the work that you're doing as well. With that, I know that Matt's got some good stuff to talk about. I want to turn it over to him. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for being here this afternoon. It's our pleasure to hear what you have to say around generative AI.
Well, thank you, Rick. Hi to everyone out in Zoomverse. I took a look at the participants list a moment ago, and I saw a couple of names of people that I know, and some I haven't seen for a long time. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Well, how about you?
Doing all right, yeah. And other people that I don't yet know. I'm glad that you all have taken some time to join us here today. Or if you're watching this in a recording form, hi to you in the future. So I just want to start by saying I am grateful for the opportunity to come and talk with you about AI. But I'm going to attach to that moment of gratitude sort of a general comment, which is I think I'm not the only one who is maybe getting to be a little bit tired of the fact that AI is everywhere at the moment, or at least the conversation about AI is everywhere. And frankly, it has become overwhelming to me personally, at least. I think there are more articles every day that I make a note that I should read about AI than there is actual time for me to go and read those articles. So I don't know if I'm ever going to catch up with all the things that I've made a note that I need to look at, but so that's my perspective. I also want to share just a little bit about myself. I don't know on what basis Rick made his decision to invite me. There are a lot of people who are talking about AI at the moment. So I just want to share a little bit about myself, which in a way is my justification for why I think I should be here, or why it's okay that I'm here. I'm not sure why some people are talking about AI. But so a couple of things about myself. One is I'm trained as a political scientist. That's what my PhD is from the University of Minnesota. I'll let my political scientist flag show in a couple of places in our talk today. But I'm also a person who has not been in a full-time teaching position for a long time and has transitioned into what is usually referred to as an alt-ac career, an alternate academic career. Which is kind of related to professional development, but kind of isn't. I work in the e-learning team. I know at least one of my colleagues is here. Hi, Noah. But as I've made that transition, one of the great things about it is, even though I do love political science, I think I've actually found that I love thinking about learning even more. So in some ways, my academic interests have changed over the years to be focused more upon pedagogy. So why is that important? Well, I believe seriously that how people learn can be the subject of empirical research, that it's possible to develop evidence-supported best practices when it comes to education. We'll come back to that. And that kind of developing body of knowledge about how we learn and how we should help people learn can often be in tension with the things that we do in and out of the classroom based upon either anecdote or on our own experience. So there will be a few moments where I hope maybe some criticisms feel a little close to home. Let's see, I'm also, I don't usually make statements in the superlative, but I'm really tech savvy. I've been programming since I was in 4th grade, which is more interesting because 4th grade for me was in the 1980s. That was before the era of the World Wide Web. At the point that I learned how to code for the web, I already knew at least 3 different programming languages, and technology has always been an interest of mine and always something that I've incorporated into my teaching. Why is that important? Well, I think I can actually say that the average person probably understands this much. I don't know if you can see on the camera, this much about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. I'd like to claim that I understand this much, okay? So that is a quantitative difference. And for reference, even the people who are developing generative AI systems have said they don't understand how they work. So keep that in mind. And I also want that to frame the fact that I am not a Luddite. Everything I say today is not driven out of a fear or a reaction against technological change. It's not based upon doubt, but I am someone who is not easily impressed when it comes to technology. Okay, I'm also a big believer in the liberal arts. That's where my undergraduate degree is from. That is where, and the kind of things that I've done with my teaching time. Why is that important? Well, in part because I don't believe that higher education is just supposed to be job training. I think there is something more that goes on behind the scenes. And then the last thing I want to admit is that, like probably everybody who is on this Zoom call right now or listening later on, I'm someone who did fairly well in the undergraduate experience that I had. There's a little bit of a selection bias. The people who go into teaching in higher education are frequently the ones who did just fine in the system of higher education as they experienced it. So those are 5 things that I want you to know about myself. And just as a way of summarizing all that, if you want to keep a mental image about me in your head, is this one. Tomorrow, I have taken the day off and I'm going to spend the entire day, probably from 9 a.m. to 7 or 8 p.m. At my children's middle school, where I am a middle school robotics coach. And I am going to be working on the autonomous self-driving programming for the robot, which will be in the competition on Saturday. So I guess you could say in a sense, I'm also a practitioner, though there is very little artificial intelligence involved in what we're doing. Okay, so I also want to say that I've been thinking about AI for a little bit, and I want to invite you towards a resource. I and one of my colleagues in information technology, Jacob Fortman, who is in the innovation and research team, have restarted a podcast that we had a while back called T-Squared, a teaching and technology podcast. And the focus of the episodes we're doing this academic year are going to be on generative artificial intelligence. So there's information on this screen. You can scan that QR code even if you are sitting at home. It'll work. And that'll take you to the website where you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, listen on Spotify. The first episode is up. It's sort of a general overview, but we're going to have episodes focused on most of the things that, the kind of things that I'll be talking about today. And Jacob and I have said that the thing that we want this podcast to really be about is taking a closer and deeper look at generative artificial intelligence, because like I said, talk about it is everywhere, but a lot of that talk has become repetitive and a lot of it is very surface level. So we're hoping to have a better conversation about that. Okay. I've front loaded this with a whole sort of set of stipulations. One is there are a lot of conversations about AI that we could be having. These are conversations that we're not going to be having, okay? This is not going to be a talk about what is AI or generative AI. We'll kind of pass by that a little bit as we go. Come on, technology. This is not going to be a talk about how to use it or how to have your students use it. I think last month, my colleague, Justin, talked a little bit about some considerations that way. It's also not going to be about the practical considerations of whether you should use it Although as I went through and prepared for today, I feel like there's a certain tone to what I'm going to say, but I'm not saying that as a conclusion. Finally, it's not about how to make students AI literate, although that might be something very important that we need to be talking about, but those are not conversations that I want to have today. Okay, so what I do want to talk about is very specifically one kind of artificial intelligence. And I think it's important to make this distinction because the popular discourse about AI has brought into the conversation AI as a general term, but I think almost every single issue that we're dealing with related to AI over the last, 10 or 11 months, is not about AI in general, which is a field that goes back not 100 years, but I mean decades and decades. The first predictions about artificial intelligence and its impact upon education were actually in the early 1970s. By the way, at that point, the prediction was that by the end of the 1970s, there would be no more teachers because AI would have solved it all. So just so you know. But what we're talking about is really this generative artificial intelligence, which from a technical point of view, the kind of thing that's being done is referred to as a large language model or an LLM. So have that term in your mind. And I'll try to distinguish things so that I'm talking just about this kind of AI. Okay, so a couple of more stipulations that I want to get out of the way. I don't know why I'm being so stipulative today, but first of all, these are provisional thoughts. There were things that I was thinking of in the car on the way here that I quickly went and put into the slides, which are not in the slides, which I'll share at the end. So I'm going to have to upload a new copy of that. So these are provisional thoughts. There are some things that I simply don't have a personal answer to, but these are things that have occurred to me. Second of all, I want to just make a very clear statement, which is kind of hard for some people to hold on to, but I think the conversation about AI is not just everywhere, but it has definitely reached hype levels. And it's done so faster than most previous technologies. There is this actual formal thing that people analyze called the hype cycle, right? About when sort of information and press about a particular technology rises, and then how that relates to people's expectation. It's a fun thing, and you can find all sorts of graphs online showing various technologies and where they have fallen and when those curves have peaked. But I say this because at the moment it's really hard to believe it, but at some point the furor will die down. And just to help you realize that, for the record, the sky was falling pretty much every time one of these things on the slide was first introduced, right? Google was first going to be the challenge to education, then Wikipedia. Anybody remember Google Glass? My Facebook feed reminded me the other day of the only time, 10 years ago, where I wore a Google Glass. It's one of now many products Google has abandoned, okay? MOOCs were going to change the face of education in 2012, 2013. VR, AR, XR, we are still apparently going to be having a revolution. Badging, right? Badging and this idea that micro-credentialing was going to throw out the old system of higher education. And then crypto, crypto and VR and even badging, the hype isn't over, but I think we've passed some of it. And given that Sam Bankman-Fried is, and they did convict him, right? Yeah, they convicted him. That's, in some ways a legal nail in the coffin that crypto is a magical panacea for everything, let alone education. Okay, so these were all cycles which have largely passed. Note that some of these education has weathered and survived, right? Somehow we managed to continue with Wikipedia. And the weird thing is, I don't know if this is still the case, but maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, there was actually a study that showed that in terms of reliability of information, Wikipedia was on average as good or better than the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's because despite the idea of crowdsourcing information being an opportunity for people to sow it with all sorts of misinformation, oddly enough, the average person who edits things on Wikipedia is anal retentive about precision and frequently are experts in their area, which might be like, the appearance of aliens and Star Trek episodes or something, but we've weathered most of these. So as much as the dominance of generative artificial intelligence seems inevitable right now, we will get to a point where the conversation will simmer down, okay? Other stipulations, one, so much of the conversation about generative AI is simplistic, and that's not helpful because the world is not simple and we are not simple people. One side, it can't be avoided, adapt or die, right? I actually was watching presentations from a recent conference, and there's a title of one of the presentations, it was, "Don't be an ostrich." I think I was actually offended by that. The suggestion there that, I mean, obviously you have to give in, and if you're burying your head in the sand, clearly there's a problem with you. On the other side, of course, the "it's evil incarnate, adopt and die" approach is also not helpful, because I don't think we're going to get any mileage out of that. Okay, and then the final thing I want to say, this whole conversation is framed in terms of ethics. I am both a political scientist and a philosopher by training, so I can't resist becoming slightly Kantian for a moment and noting that when we talk about ethics, we're talking about a very special realm of consideration that always involves a discussion about which community are we talking about. Ethics are about the norms, the chosen norms for particular communities. Obviously, today we're talking from the perspective of a particular community, higher education. We could even specialize that even more and talk about where we are geographically or where we are sort of in the higher education market. But I think that's always worth considering, because frequently the conversations that we have about AI, we end up switching contexts about community we're talking about. And it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about the considerations, and then about what we as members of that community should or should not be doing, what we should or should not be valuing. And ethics do change over time. So I'm not suggesting that they're baked in stone, but they are part of the discourse of the community itself. Okay, so again, sorry for coming back to this point. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could have in this conversation related to ethics and AI. So I'm not going to talk about the question of what happens when students use AI to complete assignments. Justin talked about that a little last month. It's probably the number one practical concern for most faculty when it comes to generative AI. It's clearly an ethical issue in terms of learners as members of a learning community. I'll talk around this a little bit, but I'm also not going to talk about the question of, are there ethical problems with the way that generative AI models are trained on the basis of possible copyrighted materials? Is there infringement either in the training of the models or even in the production of content from them? I'm not going to talk about bias in AI, which is a big and recognized issue. And it comes in a couple flavors, right? Not talking about generative AI, but talking about things like facial recognition. There's a lot of press out there that talks about how facial recognition systems have problems with individuals who have darker complexions. They're simply not recognized as well and matched properly, which leads to far higher false positives. If you have a smartwatch on your wrist that measures your heart rate, there is bias on your wrist because in addition to facial recognition, the ability to detect heart rates through skin is affected by skin pigmentation. So the devices will not work as well for those who have non-Caucasian skin. Beyond that, when it comes to generative AI, there's issues of bias in the training data of all sorts, based upon the fact that right now the idea is scrape every corner of the internet for every bit of free text that you can find, which means it's both academic texts as well as comics, as well as the comments on all the news articles in your local newspaper. Okay. So the environmental impacts of generative AI are an important topic. We're going to talk about it on that T-Squared podcast. There's a lot of resources that go into the creation of large language models, and they're being used, and it's certainly not helping solve climate change. I'll put it as simply as that. In some ways, this is an interesting issue because it's a technical question. In theory, we get better computers that are more efficient, we have less environmental impact. So it's a big ethical issue, but unlike a lot of the others, it could have a way to address it technologically. Okay, other things, I'm not going to talk about the fact that the way a lot of these language models work is they have a second step in which people in developing countries are paid very low substandard wages to do things like look at output from generative AI and to wag the finger at it and say, how dare you say this? Please don't ever say this again, right? A lot of the reasons that ChatGPT and such say things like, I'm not allowed to talk about, or, advise you, you should not be trying to break the law. It's not because the artificial intelligence is great and smart, it's because people have been given the task of giving it rules and safeguards to not give that information. Problem is, frequently those are easy to circumvent, so. And then, of course, we're talking about the role of job training and education. The fact that people might lose their jobs related to the rise of generative artificial intelligence, that's a big ethical consideration too, okay? But I want to go higher up the tree for some harder to reach fruit. We've got a peach tree in our yard, which turned out to be far taller than we ever expected. It's hard to get to those peaches at the top. We wait for them to fall down. But today we're going to try to climb the tree, or at least shake it a little bit, to get some of those harder to get issues before us. And some of these are ethical dilemmas that we really should be confronting, regardless of whether we personally make the decision to use generative AI or not. So it's not just related to our roles as academics within the classroom and our own instructional practice, but it's related to the question of who we are as part of the community of education and broader communities. Okay, so number one, marginalizing the learner. We've already seen that a common likely response to generative artificial intelligence and concerns about academic integrity is to return to kinds of assessments that many people have moved away from. So if you don't trust that students are using ChatGPT to write their paper at home, have them do in-class writing. If you've been doing projects outside of the classroom and you can't trust that they're doing it on their own, have them do it in the classroom, or maybe go back to something like a high-stakes exam. In computer science, believe it or not, is one of the areas that is dealing with this a lot. How do we deal with writing code? There's actually talk among many academic and political scientists that the secret is actually to have future programmers come to the classroom, take out a pen, and write programs on a piece of paper. That should sound odd. And it does. I haven't seen it quite yet, but a great possibility would be the rise of oral examinations. If you can't trust what people are doing when you're not looking at them, assess them while you're looking at them. Okay? Okay, there's a real possibility that in responding to the threat of generative artificial intelligence, we end up undoing a lot of gains that we've made over the last 15 or 20 years, which have been towards what you could generally refer to as a more learner-centered pedagogy. There's a whole lot that goes into that giant umbrella term, but I think it's clear that much of these assessment changes end up going against those trends. So, there's evidence that in trying to make our assessments AI-proof, if there even is such a thing, in order to prevent cheating, or it doesn't have to be about preventing cheating, right? You could frame things in a very legitimate way, being able to more authentically assess student learning, right? That's the positive version of this idea, that we will ultimately damage the validity and the reliability of the assessments we use to measure learning. And that's because we presume that things like taking a test are an accurate measure of learning. But there's plenty of research out there that shows when you give a test, you are not just measuring learning. And disproportionately for some students, you end up measuring other things. You end up measuring things like anxiety. Test anxiety is a big one. You also end up introducing into the equation bias that can result from certain forms of testing. Those are very real things that end up then changing whether what you're getting is an accurate and authentic measurement of what students are learning. So, connected to that, I think there are very real consequences. I think there are very real consequences if we change how we approach our students. And if we first approach them as, let's to be honest in a way, criminals first, and as learners second. Certainly nobody in this group is guilty of this, but I have seen, overheard, been near plenty of academic conversations where you would presume that every student in a given class this is true of even some disciplines, everyone is out to cheat all the time. And that shapes, first of all, the way in which you approach your students then will subtly change the way in which you actually then treat them in broader ways. But it damages things from the student side as well, because that is a message that will come through loud and clear to your students. And there is plenty of research that show the importance of things like rapport with faculty. The concept that, I don't know if people have used this term, but I'm starting to use it, the idea of solicitude. How much does your faculty member, your professor actually care that you exist and who you are as part of the learning community? Those then have an impact upon things like student motivation and persistence. If you're operating from a presumption that your professor believes you're going to cheat no matter what, and in a sense, you have to work to justify and prove the work you're doing is your own work, that's going to affect bottom lines of an enrollment. And from a psychological point of view, it also represents a huge problem. How many of you, I mean, I can't see everybody's hands really, but I'm gonna say this anyway. How many of you have heard of the fundamental attribution error? Not many, and I don't see everybody on the screen, but okay. Fundamental attribution error is a psychological concept that suggests, and not suggests, I mean, it demonstrates what we know to be true, that usually when we're thinking about the behavior of other people, we presume their motivations are based upon internal flaws. The problem is their character. A student cheats because they're simply a bad person at heart, and they don't want to learn. For ourselves, we always presume that the cause of our motivation is external. I was late today because, oh, that traffic jam that stopped me from getting here. Actually, traffic. I had this myself. I was driving down that road, whose name? Oh, O'Brien, coming from Allendale to downtown. It's a nice scenic drive. And there was this white SUV in front of me. I don't know who they were, but they spent not half the time, but I'm increasing it in my mind, of course, half the time straddling the center line, weaving back and forth, not paying attention, because clearly, what? Fill in the blank. They're a bad driver, or they're texting or something, right? The fact is, everyone is always facing a battle that we don't know about. And we're willing to give ourselves slack for those battles, but not to acknowledge those of others. Was it a single mother who's taking her baby to the hospital or something, and the child is crying? I actually had my wife one time had our firstborn in the car driving somewhere, and he threw up everywhere in the car, right? I don't think this happened in this case, but this is something we do with motivations of others. And the problem is the fundamental attribution error, if it's guiding the way in which we treat students, I don't think that brings us any benefit at all in terms of what we're going to get from students. Okay. That whole can of worms was really in a sense about a negative, right? It was about the idea that reacting to generative AI could lead us to regress in a way, which ethically I'm going to suggest we really shouldn't. Oops, that's not the direction to go. Okay, so that was an argument about regression, but I think there's actually a positive version of this. It kind of step forward, which involves ethics in a different sense. So this we can talk about as the idea of pedagogical opportunity. So the standard model, we could say, of higher education has a few components. And if there were more people in the classroom, okay, the burden is on your shoulders, people. The standard model of education, if you had to stereotype what a college education looks like, includes a few identified components. What does the average and not necessarily good college class look like? Again, none of us here are guilty of these, but let me help you out. Lots of lectures.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Lots of lectures, right? Passive lectures. People sitting in
Rows,
desk, right? Architecture is an interesting component about educational models. A couple of high stakes exams, right? Very few opportunities to be assessed. And also lots of writing, right? I mean, not every class has writing, but I mean, there are plenty of classes where one of the few assessment methods is a big paper that gets written at some point, right? Okay. So there's a real, okay, actually, let me lay this out in terms of a couple of steps here to sort of make my argument. So step number one, oftentimes the assessment choices that we make don't really match up with our learning objectives. It's like a square peg in a round hole, right? So, I won't ask for a show of hands in this regard, but I mean, how many people have assigned longish form writing assignments, but have never clearly spelled out in their learning objectives that writing and learning to write well itself is one of the learning objectives that you're teaching in your course? And I mean, there's a simple solution, right? Oh, add it as a learning objective. But if you have a learning objective, you do bear some responsibility of then making sure that students are capable of reaching that objective. How many people are willing to, in the midst of their academic content, build in the time necessary to actually address writing and to help those who have difficulties with writing? One example, right? That's why we have great resources like the Writing Center on campus, but we can't always offload all of that, right? There is an ethical aspect here in a couple of ways. One is that we really should be upfront with our students about what it is that they're going to come away from our classes with, which is then presumably how we're assessing them. So if writing is something that we want to put the time into assessing, it should stand up loud and proud with all the other things that we're hoping students come away with. Maybe even more importantly, though, there's a lot of talk recently in education about the idea of the hidden curriculum. Has anyone heard of the hidden curriculum? The idea that there are all sorts of aspects, especially of higher educational practice, where some members of society are much better able to meet them. It's influenced by things like K-12 educational background, disadvantages, family experience in contact with higher education. And there's simply a lot of things that we presume that students are able to or should be able to do in our classrooms. And for some people, they can't right off the bat. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not able to, given the right support, which might include support from us as well. But the fact is, to the extent that we build it in and presume it should happen, we are creating systematic disadvantages and bias in our classrooms in terms of how we assess student learning. Okay, so that was logic step one. For some reason, my slides here are not, oh, okay, I see. Technology is playing a joke on me, but. So logic step number two, one of the reasons I think that we heavily rely upon writing is we have a false equivalence, which is starting to get shown for what it is. And the false equivalence is that the ability to write equals the ability to show knowledge, which I mean, this is one of the biggest assumptions that generative AI is challenging, because now we have tools that are able to generate writing, which in many cases seem like they represent knowledge. Software can now do things that presumably you had to be a human to do before. And this is, of course, is what's driving a lot of the pedagogical panic in higher education. Here's a little secret, though. Writing has never been a perfect proxy for demonstrating knowledge. It never has. Students have always had other family members edit their papers. My father-in-law took a couple of times to get through college. When he finally did it, his wife wrote his papers for him, right? When I was an undergrad, it was very common to identify the person on your dorm floor who wrote best and make sure that they edited your paper, sometimes in exchange for a late night pizza, right? Of course, we encourage students to visit the Writing Center. I mean, in theory, we're sharpening their own writing skills, but what comes out and shows up on the digital page or physical page is not purely them in that regard. And we, of course, know that students buy papers online, recycle their own work. The fact is, writing has never been a pure demonstration of knowledge. And the fact is, if we presume that writing is this proxy for knowledge, we start adding all sorts of other things that become problematic. We start doing things like making what ultimately should be inconsequential things affect our evaluation, things like mechanics and word choice. Once again, if you don't have a learning objective about, always be able to choose the right word for the situation, is that the basis on which you should be deducting points? An entirely different conversation is whether we should be talking about points at all in education, but I'll have Rick invite you back to that. And the fact is, these things, they do create subtle bias in how we evaluate. In my own classes right now, what I say about writing, I don't take off 1 point for every spelling error or a point for a split infinitive. Because frankly, I have better things to do with my time than count split infinitives. And I imagine you all do too. What I say is, the problem for me is when the problems of a mechanical or other related nature get in the way of my understanding what you're trying to say. That's when we start having a conversation. But from that point of view, that's all that I care about in terms of how you're writing. Okay, so that was logic step number 2. Writing is not a perfect proxy. So then let's go to logic step number 3. There's been a movement out there in educational circles for many years now to try to move faculty towards what are called authentic assessments. Now, authentic assessment is one of those great buzzwords that never actually has a precise meaning compared to what some people act like it does. And this is a movement which really is still fighting for traction in higher education. There's going to be a workshop that the FTLC will be leading in May of this coming year related to authentic assessment, because it's something we need to talk about. It can mean simply having student complete less formulaic kinds of assignments, right? The typical 15-page semester term, right? Which is a very generic concept. It can also mean, though, less writing, moving to activities that are more representative of what students might do when they're in those fields. I don't know how many students we're actually educating where writing term papers will be a big part of their job. Not a lot. Here's the thing, we're educators to the extent that we desire to be published or to have our scholarship of teaching recognized. We write papers, right? We're fairly good at making sure our students do the work that we do. But even if we're not thinking about things as job training, students will end up at different places in the world, and there might be better ways to assess what they're doing than using what's right for us. And the fact is, better, more authentic assessments, they have a lot of advantages for them when it comes to what research is showing. They frequently capture student interest and lead to greater student engagement with the work, and frequently then better demonstrations of what students have learned compared to then when you simply have them completing a paper and they're struggling to just write a term paper as opposed to demonstrate what they've learned. Okay, so in short, it's possible for our response to generative artificial intelligence to actually be a force for moving towards better pedagogy in higher education, to the extent that pedagogical panic about what AI can do can actually help lend support for what we have already been finding, which is there are better ways to be doing things at all. Okay. Number 3. So we're going to talk about efficiency in 2 senses here. The first is what I'll call the siren call of efficiency, practical edition. Okay. It's like CSI Las Vegas versus New Orleans, whatever. Okay. One of the biggest pitches for generative AI is that it makes things faster and it makes things easier. Pretty sure of that. And ultimately, let's be realistic or crass, depending upon how you want to see it. What that means frequently in conversations, that boils down to money, financial savings, right? If I can save time on this, guess what I can do? Okay. And I've actually seen this phrase when it comes to generative artificial intelligence. It will take care of all those things that right now we have to do it. And if you don't have to do it, should you do it at all, right? Lots of fun stories in the press about, for example, Vanderbilt University getting into trouble for using generative artificial intelligence to write a condolence letter in response to a public tragedy. Well, at some point we're going to have a conversation about whether that's appropriate or not. I mean, is it okay for a condolence letter? Or, I don't know if President Mantella writes everything herself, but would it be all right for her to generate, a artificial intelligence response to the crisis in Gaza Strip? I know we'll have that conversation, but the fact is that is the marketing right now. There are all sorts of things you should be doing to save time for yourself. Save a few seconds here by letting AI choose the right picture for you, or by writing the text of that email that you have to send to your dean. By the way, faculty report that they're happy letting AI write letters for their faculty activity reports and things, but they're not happy when their deans use artificial intelligence to write communication to them. So that's a whole other issue we could talk about, is the one-sidedness. And then we're already seeing the first round of ed tech tools pitched at this with educational purposes. I think I'm letting the cat out of the bag here by saying this. We have not turned some of these features on. And by the way, I realize there's a certain weirdness here that I'm drinking out of a Blackboard water bottle and tech. Blackboard has added features to Learn Ultra, which allow faculty to generate outlines automatically of possible contents of a module, to write rubrics based upon content. And there are more features that they're planning. Why? Well, I'm not sure it's because everybody is asking for them, but it's because obviously it's the right thing to do. Because that is what we need to do to save academic time and streamline what we do. The issue is there that edtech companies are leapfrogging a conversation that we should be having in the first place. And they're rushing to bring us what we actually haven't talked about, which is whether promoting and pursuing efficiency in education is always a good thing. Where might it be okay? In what parts of teaching might it be okay to use generative artificial intelligence? Okay, big claim. I'm going to say that practically speaking, I believe that embracing efficiency can only be counterproductive for faculty. I'm not usually a doom and gloom person, but this is probably my gloomiest, okay? So here's the thing. Higher education already has an unresolved labor problem. If you don't realize this, you're the ostrich with your head in the sand, really. For decades, higher education has been reducing the role of tenured faculty, outsourcing curricular work to corporate entities that manage and create degree programs, and also then becoming more contingent and more dependent on contingent faculty. The more that we suggest that our job as educators can be done through generative AI, the more we contribute to the problems of education in the future. I think, and I'm not a prognosticator because I don't think most people are generally right when they predict the future, but I'm fairly sure that at the trajectory we're going right now, we will see the possible rise of institutions where courses are designed by AI, overseen by AI, and evaluated by AI. We already have institutions of decent repute where the degree programs, the people who are teaching the classes, are brought in at roughly the last moment to teach it. They did not develop the class. The first time they see the syllabus is a couple of weeks before they do it. They're not allowed to make any changes, and all they do is monitor discussion and maybe look at a few papers. That is current practice. And guess what? Those faculty are a lot cheaper than the people they paid to develop the classes. So I think that contributing to that is always going to be a lose-lose proposition. And I am in a situation where technology is leaving me without my notes. There we go. Okay. So possible rise of AI institutions. And there's a real problem here because we're presuming, first of all, that generative artificial intelligence would be good at any of these tasks in the first place, which I think it's worth considering. But ultimately, we know that the effect of this will be decreasing student contact with faculty. I hate to keep making that generic reference to there's research out there, but there is. Research is showing that one of the greatest predictors of student success in higher education is their contact with real human beings, with their faculty and their staff. One study shows that having a significant relationship with staff or faculty, I don't know exactly what that means, has a 3 times increase in their self-reported view that college was worthwhile at all. And also then a similar increase in terms of whether they see themselves as thriving in life after college. Already, very small numbers of students, from one study, maybe 27% of students, think their faculty care about them, which is, I think, a very sad statistic. And not one that we should contribute to by making it harder for students to have contact with faculty in the first place. Okay, there are dots to connect here, right? So the fact is, AIU, if we could coin the name for this future institution, is going to be a much cheaper business model than education as we have it now. And at the point where we are now, where AIs are generally owned by corporate entities, certainly invites the opportunity for greater corporate influence in educational institutions. But when we take the labor problem of higher education and then intersect it with the other problem that we're dealing with, the cost problem of skyrocketing prices for higher education and trying to justify to the public why it's worthwhile, everything simply gets worse. And I think the fact is we could in the future face the creation of a new digital divide. Some will only be able to afford a higher education degree through the availability of low-cost artificial intelligence institutions, because those will be within the scope of what's possible financially. And then others will continue to have access to whatever traditional institutions turn into, where there might be a presence of artificial intelligence, but hopefully there's still a valuing of the role of faculty as individuals, both in terms of their humanity and in terms of their personal knowledge. I don't like being this negative, but currently I'm feeling that way. So I struggled to figure out where to make this next point, but there's another problem with focusing on practical efficiency, in that it can create an antagonism between learners and their faculty as well. I mean, imagine the student backlash when students find out that faculty are using artificial intelligence in the creation and running of their own classes. And yet the policy, either at the institution level or at the course level, is that they can't use artificial intelligence. I think this is simply a recipe for future legal problems. At the moment in the state of Michigan, there is a lawsuit by students filed against Central Michigan, Eastern Michigan, and Lake Superior State University. Students suing, saying that those institutions, when they moved to remote learning because of COVID, as if we could have, stopped that students deserve a tuition refund because they were not getting the education they were promised. Hopefully your brain is boiling over with all the problems with that statement. But the fact is, it's establishing a legal precedent that litigation is possible when it comes to educational expectations. I'm hoping the case is thrown out and it goes no farther, but I am not guessing that one. We will have broader problems. Imagine when students then realize that they could sue because their professor didn't grade their papers, because they were graded by generative AI. Perhaps even worse then is actually the problem of what happens when students start believing their faculty aren't necessary. If the syllabus can be written by AI, if an open educational text can be written by AI, we have AIs now that can generate images. The PowerPoints are created by AI. There's nothing fancy about text to speech. The speaking voice over those slides could be AI. What's going to happen when students start realizing that faculty are not as important? And I'm not saying they are, but what if the perception is that? The problem is we feed into that perception. Okay, it's hard enough to get students to do the things that we're seeing are important and useful for the learning process. Okay, so the second thing, efficiency and the application of expertise. This is a somewhat more abstract and philosophical argument, but I think it might be even more important in a way. In ed tech, the hardest push appears to be making some teaching tasks more efficient. And I mentioned things like writing rubrics, writing outlines, exam questions, all this kind of stuff. There are the most recent demo I saw of features coming to an unnamed learning management system included artificial intelligence suggesting a better assignment than the one that you think you're giving. So you say what assignment you want to do, and it says, here's how you can make it better. Now, it's driven by good intentions, but this is what ed tech is trying to bring to us. We've got two intersecting issues that create a problem here. The first is the message that is at the bottom of pretty much every press release from an AI company, or at the bottom of ChatGPT, which is always, be sure to double check everything, right? We're not guaranteeing that this is correct or this is reliable. That slogan has been around forever, right? Caveat emptor, buyer beware. So that's a great marketing slogan, but it cuts entirely against the entire reason that generative AI is being pitched: convenience and efficiency. Because the fact is, should check in reality means won't check. Because we're human and because we do value our time. Efficiency is a slippery slope. I don't know if you've noticed, but the Surgeon General's warning on packs of cigarettes hasn't stopped people from smoking. We still have people die of lung cancer. Decades after we've known that there might possibly be a connection there? Okay, second half of the problem. One is the fact that we're on a slope where we're supposed to, but we won't check. And then the question is, what are we doing? So a common perspective, trying to find a middle ground when it comes to generative AI is, well, I don't use it to create final products. I use it to generate ideas. But is this really a safe position? Political scientists showing now, two political scientists, Peter Bachrach and Morton Barras, wrote an article published in the American Political Science Review, the premier journal in American political science, back in 1962, and it was titled The Two Faces of Power. They took to task both the entire discipline of sociology and the entire discipline of political science in saying that studying power, which was a big topical deal at the time, was being done wrong, that there are really two kinds of power. One is what we normally think of, the ability to force people to do things, whether it's military might or whatever. The other, though, the hidden face of power, is the ability to simply take things off of the agenda, to make them not be considered, right? The news that is suppressed will never be talked about. And it is a very important form of power. Now, there's a certain malevolence behind trying to understand the role of societal elites manipulating agendas. I'm not suggesting that about artificial intelligence, but there is something similar that happens. Large language models are based on predictive statistical outputs. They're autocorrect on mammoth amounts of steroids. Autocorrect is something we understand. The amount of steroids involved are unfathomable from a digital point of view, but it allows magical things to happen. But what it means is things that are less likely or less common in terms of the universe that it ingests are simply, logically, less likely to come out, right? Because if it's taking the trillions of words from all of existence and giving you 200 words as a summary, it's not including all the variety of detail. It's simply a logical conclusion. One aspect of generative artificial intelligence that's really not talked about is the fact that the way in which these language models work is a lot like the realm of image compression, which we used to have to think about in the days of limited storage space and slow internet, but we don't think about it anymore. The goal of large language models is to take large amounts of information and represent them in a smaller, efficient way. The only way you can do that, if you think about images, is by losing detail. Some details will inherently get lost because that detail is not captured in the weights of the nodes of the neural network that represents somehow the connections that the AI has found among everything said in the language it's consumed. Things that are underrepresented in training data may be excluded entirely in the model, which means they will not show up in what you're asking it to produce. We mentioned bias. I said I wasn't going to talk about bias, but I do want to talk about bias for a moment. We know that the content that goes into large language models has lots of different kinds of biases. And I'm not just talking about the traditional kinds that we worry about in higher ed, but the fact is there is a lot of bias, which means to the extent that we think we're going to get out things that are true or neutral, we're actually more likely to get out the biased content. Here's the interesting thing. The way in which a lot of these large language models deal with it is this is where those underpaid individuals in foreign countries come into play. You can read descriptions of this. They spend all day giving large language models thousands of prompts, seeing what responses are generated, and then saying yes to this, no to that. In theory, this helps remove bias. But think about it. This is not the equivalent of removing bias from the model. It's the equivalent, no, it is. It's not an equivalent. It is saying to the model, I know you're biased, just be quiet about it. And don't talk about your bias in this way. The training process for these models takes months. It takes computing resources on unfathomable scales compared to what we do here using our computers. It's not like they simply rerun this when they realize this shouldn't be in there. The bias is still there. The bias can still come out through other kinds of prompts. Okay, And here's the thing, I would argue that in education, one of the things we do most often and that we do most importantly is to focus on things that don't have as much of the spotlight. So when you use generative AI to create the syllabus for your class, what is not represented on those syllabi? For all the reasons that we've talked about. It's going to be the things that might be the most important or interesting to talk about. I'm not just talking about traditionally marginalized scholars. I'm talking about all sorts of ideas. I hope you can connect the dots here on your own when we talk about the need to double check, the fact that I'm not going to, but no, I'm just generating ideas, right? Let me put a finer point on it though. Maybe we'll be good about double checking what generative AI gives us, but we probably won't. The more we do it, the more it cuts against efficiency. So there's less reason to do it. And the more it seems okay, the more we'll trust it in the future. And if we rely upon it, there are two problems that come from that. One is, first of all, we're supposed to be modeling for our students. I established in my syllabus this semester a claim that anytime I use generative AI, I will tell them. And I'm telling them how I'm using it. I want to model for my students what behavior is right within the community that we're talking about. And here's the thing, our students are also, unfortunately, not equipped at the moment with what it takes to successfully interrogate what generative AI provides. It's easier for us as experts, but it's not for them as those who are, don't think about it as lower down, just think about it as not far along the path of education, knowledge, whatever you want to think of it as. The one thing we truly have to offer in the educational process is our expertise. The fact that we are farther along on this journey. The fact that we have become more advanced in our learning. And the more we rely on generative AI, even when it seems innocent to do so, the more we abdicate our expertise. And the more those who are in positions to make decisions about what we do will let it happen. Okay, this is the last one, really. I know that we're running short on time, but is education about job training? Is it about life preparation? I don't know, probably both. But I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the fact that in the academy, we don't just propagate knowledge and skills, we also reflect on them. We encourage our learners to be reflective as well. I'm not sure this is really the same thing as critical thinking, but we can use critical thinking as a proxy here for this idea. The generative AI moment is really being driven by two forces, which are working against our goals as educators. One is an immense commercialization pressure. It's an arms race. It's not because generative AI is solving the problem, it's because Google added generative AI because they needed to make sure they can get money from investors. So the money wasn't just going to OpenAI. Microsoft added ChatGPT to Bing so that people would have a reason to use Bing instead of using Google search. This is all driven by the fact that someone is hoping to get rich. I'm also not the kind of person who believes that capitalism is the root of all flaws or evils. But the second force is the fact that the average person doesn't understand anything about how generative AI works. And they don't want to. Okay, these two forces have worked to hide the fact that our conversation about generative artificial intelligence is really, when it comes down to it, or should be, about one familiar basic concept, and that's trust. In particular, who do you trust, why do you trust them, and what do you trust them for? And this really comes back to the question of expertise that we talked about before. Traditional AI, not generative AI, has been around for a long time. This is usually taking the form of what are referred to as expert systems. The idea is to create a knowledge base within one closed area, and you do so by plumbing the depths of knowledge of people who are experts in that area and trying to recreate their knowledge and their decision-making process. That is not how generative artificial intelligence works. Generative artificial intelligence is not the knowledge of experts, it's 100% the opposite. Instead of specialized expert knowledge, it's the wisdom of the crowd. And it's not even the wisdom of the crowd, it's the language of the crowd. Instead of knowledge being stored as propositions, it's simply about the statistical analysis of what language people have used in the past and how often they're likely to use it. This leads to several flawed or simplistic, this is a result of several flawed or simplistic assumptions. First, that language equals knowledge. That if you look at something that was written, it represents knowledge in some way. Perhaps worse, the idea that more language equals more knowledge. ChatGPT and the like have gotten better, some say smarter, because they now ingest more language. But that doesn't mean they ingest more knowledge. And then the other assumption is that predicting language equals revealing knowledge, and knowledge that should be trusted. If you spit back some distillation, what has been said about everything, everywhere, over the course of all time that's in the training data, that means something. Don't get me wrong, generative AI does amazing things, but let's take off the gee whiz glasses for a moment and return to thinking critically about trust. I mean, imagine that you had an assignment the students needed to complete. Which of these sources would you allow for that project? Would you let students use a high school government textbook as opposed to a college government textbook? Would you let a student use a textbook that was written by, insert the name of somebody you wouldn't trust? Someone who believes in a flat earth, a scholar with demonstrated white supremacist sympathies. Would you let students use word on the street evidence? Good old Jay Leno's interviews on the street. Or would you let students use the Weekly World News? Remember that? As they checkout lane at the supermarket. It wasn't just the fact the information was wrong, it was deliberately wrong. Aliens in the White House and all that kind of stuff. Would you allow those to be used? I mean, to put it simplistically, generative AI has read everything, but it understands nothing because it is not capable of understanding. Computational linguist Emily Menon-Benders, this is a person who studies what these do and have helped these systems become better, describes large language models as stochastic parrots, an entity for haphazardly stitching together sequences of linguistic forms according to probabilistic information about how they combine, but without any reference to meaning. But because of our implicit bias to believe that writing equals meaning, we're amazed by what they can do. So beyond the importance of information literacy and critical thinking as a political scientist, I can't stop thinking about what comes next, what the next step is. Who we trust has a lot to say within who we cede authority or power to. And it touches on all three aspects of trust: who, why, and what. I mean, what do we let ultimately artificial intelligence do for us? And do we have a good basis for doing so? And these issues pop up in other things we haven't even talked about. Some people have come to value generative artificial intelligence for summarizing things, right? Here's a long thing, I don't want to read it, give me a summary. There are whole departments here whose entire existence is predicated on the idea that creating a summary of something is not a simple technical task, that every summary always embodies philosophical, contextual, sociological biases, that there are viewpoints encoded in how we decide to eliminate things. Why do I trust that ChatGPT gave me a summary of something? And why do I trust that it's actually valuable? And then what do I do with that? Okay. Okay, conclusions. So if you need to slip out physically or digitally, that's okay. I'm so close to done. If we hadn't waited so long to get started, I'd be exactly at one. So two conclusions, one external and one internal. First, externally, this is what occurred to me in the car on the way here. I think we need to go on the offensive. And as education, as a community of higher education, we need to seize the narrative. So far, higher education's response has been represented by disciplines that focus on generating content and how they are in crisis moments because of that. Writing. How many stories about generative artificial intelligence are about, I can't have this writing assignment anymore because ChatGPT can do it. You're also seeing this with programming. Well, computers can generate code. What do we teach programmers to do? I think we need to start going on the offensive and changing the conversation so it's not coming from people who are in generative disciplines, but the voices that are louder should be coming from disciplines that focus upon analysis and critique and bringing that knowledge to bear on what role generative artificial intelligence should have within our communities. Second, internal conclusion for us as academia. As educators, I think we have an ethical imperative to not put the cart before the horse. when it comes to teaching. And so far, our response to generative AI has been very much driven, not by education, but by commercial propaganda. And the fact that ed tech companies are trying to sell us large price tag tickets to include it shows that. Rather than commercial interest, we should be driven by learning science. There are two aspects of that. First of all, our response should be proactive, not reactive. Instead of now worrying what we have to do in the future to address what's happening, we should be using the insights of learning science, which, to be honest, have skyrocketed in the last 2 decades plus. We shouldn't wait before there's a crisis. We should be working to become better educators all the time. And the problem is, we have a unique problem with that in higher education. Higher education is an occupation which I would say has not yet become a profession. Years ago, a group of scholars described a model that identified 3 areas of knowledge that you need to sort of be a good educator. And they looked at online education first, but I think it's relevant for everything. It's called the TPAC model. It stands for technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge. So you need to have knowledge of how the technology works. I think there are like low-tech analogies of that for like in-person teaching. But you have to have your content knowledge. I mean, it's hard to educate if you don't know anything about a subject. But then that pedagogical knowledge is the thing that has traditionally been overlooked. In the College of Education, we educate future educators. We make sure that they know things, but we don't apply that to ourselves. I started grad school in 1999. At that point, then 5 years after that, in my first faculty positions, we were talking about the need to make sure our grad students got pedagogical training. We're still talking about it. We have not made progress. So what does that mean? We need to become serious about training graduate students in pedagogy. But beyond that, we need to make sure that the role of learning science needs to be formally and institutionally recognized. Okay, and here we go. This is going to be the most dangerous statement I make all day. I think we might be at a point where we need to alter our understanding of what academic freedom covers. To the extent that we are getting real meaningful information from studies of the brain and how learning happens, I think we're at the point where we can't simply fall back on the argument that I want to teach this way because I want to teach this way, and it's my academic freedom. Throw the ball. Yeah. Obviously, that's the start of a conversation, not the end. But I think that's one thing we have to do in order to find a stable ground for which to move forward and not just be worrying about what this possibly revolutionary new era in human history is going to mean for what we do. So I don't know if you want to take time for questions or if people have any.
Questions from anyone in the room or online? Lots to unpack there. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
All right, so I'm on the university conduct pool, and last year I had 8 cases that I chaired, 6 of which involved AI and plagiarism. My own opinion is that we need to reconsider what is an editor and what is an author and what is plagiarism and what should our policy in the university be about that. And that's a big complex question, I realize that.
Remember you mentioning that in Justin's presentation too. Yeah, we're dealing with it. My simplistic response, which is not a band-aid, but I mean, is to note that one of the most philosophically sound and practically useful arguments against academic dishonesty is changing assessment strategies. I mean, there is evidence that changing how you assess influences student likelihood of committing academic disintegrity. But it goes back to the whole willingness to suggest that what we're learning about learning is worth staking money on.
Right.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Any other comments or questions for Matt?
This QR code will get you a copy of the slides for whatever value you find them to be. It's slightly out of date, but it'll get updated. So.
Okay. All right, well, I want to say thanks, before everybody jumps off, thanks to Dr. Matt Roberts for being here today. Lots of really intriguing, ideas and thoughts that you've shared with us and positions that you've helped us to try to think about. And, I don't think this topic is, done. Have to be part 2, part 3, part 4. But we appreciate the opportunity for you to come in and share and get us at least thinking and moving down the road to what does this mean for us as educators? So thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Take
day.
care, everyone. Have a great day.